The Business of Biotech is produced by Life Science Connect and its community of learning, solving, and sourcing resources for biopharma decision makers. If you're working on biologics process development and manufacturing challenges, you need to swing by bioprocessonline.com. If you're trying to stay ahead of the cell or gene therapy curve, visit cellandgene.com. When it's time to map out your clinical course, let clinicalleader.com help. And if optimizing outsourcing decisions is what you're after, check out outsourcepharma.com. We're Life Science Connect, and we're here to help. Wide-ranging success is no stranger to the pharma company Incyte. The company boasts 8 approvals, all but one in its oncology, inflammation, blood disorder, and GVHD portfolios. The most recent commercial win for the company has come from its most recent major endeavor into the dermatology space. That effort has been fueled in large part by the addition of Dr. Jim Lee, Group VP and Head of Inflammation and AutoImmunity at the company since 2018, right about the time it dove headlong into the dermatology space. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech. And on today's episode, we're sitting down with Dr. Lee for an inside look at managing R&D and pipeline progress in a large multimodal multi-indication company. Dr. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
It's really nice to have you. I appreciate you coming on. And as I mentioned, Incyte is decidedly a multimodal company, having successfully developed and commercialized both large and small molecule therapies in those multiple indications that I mentioned. And I want to get a sense from your perspective, how this multimodal kind of broad indication environment impacts the research function at a company, at a larger company, larger than we typically cover, frankly, on the Business of Biotech company like Incyte. So I guess I'd start at the sort of the highest level. Why, like, what's strategic at Incyte about this multimodal approach? Why not just focus on biologics or just small molecules, or maybe just focus on oncology or a specific indication?
That's a great question. And it really comes down to our DNA at Incyte, and that's keeping the patient out in front and center. Always trying to figure out, how we can develop a drug for patients, but utilizing our science. We have a great group of biologists, of chemists, and so we're agnostic to the modality, whether it's a small molecule or a biologic. We first look at the diseases. We incorporate and come up with a list of potential targets that can help these patients, and then we try to figure out a way to develop a drug for these patients. And sometimes it's a small molecule that you apply onto your skin. Other times it would be a biologic that you inject in yourself. So it's really, we seem to be taking a multimodal approach, and it's really because we utilize the best science to try to figure out or try to develop and get drugs approved for patients. That's really how we think. That's our approach that we take, and as a result, it does look like we take or look at develop multiple types of drugs, biologics, small molecules, but it's just the opposite. We look at the patient and then we figure out what the best approach should be.
Yeah. I mean, it's a logical approach, one that can certainly create not complications, but complexity, I guess, right? Like, I mean, you when you take a patient first approach and then you pursue the modality or the target or the indication that makes best sense, and you do that in an iterative fashion in multiple places with multiple patient groups, you end up with the necessity of a lot of intellectual property, a lot of expertise in different areas, right? Like, I'm thinking at it from a very simplistic point of view, and I'm curious how that impacts the research function. I mean, I want to get a sense for how the research function gets structured at Incyte. As a result of that, we'll choose the best, most efficient path to patient centricity.
That's another great question. And
is it clear? I mean, you understand where I'm going with that question?
I hear you because you're right. It's as you try to develop multiple options for patients, that does increase the complexity of the things that we do because of all of the drugs, all of the various pathways that need to be considered. So it does create complexity, and the way we address that complexity is to structure ourselves by function. So within the R&D function, we're basically broken up into clinical development, research, which include biology and the chemistry, and then we also have our chemistry manufacture controls is what we call the CMC group. And so that's how we're broken up by function. But in terms of the project work itself, that's really done via a matrix environment, meaning we have representatives from all the different functions, clinical, regulatory, et cetera, that contribute and make sure that we have considered all the critical things when you develop drugs. And obviously those change depending on the stage of the drug. But so we have, in terms of how we're structured, we have the functions. And then in terms of the processes that we use a matrix, a team-based approach to develop drugs. We think that's the most efficient, at least for us. Obviously, other companies take slightly different approaches, but for Incyte, that's been successful, and we continue to use that approach.
So there's not like an oncology R&D department and a dermatology R&D department.
No, so we do have therapeutic area focuses in the clinical development group. But for the most part, that's really the only area where we have separate groups, just because of the specialized nature of the different diseases that we study. So obviously oncology, hematology, those are all very specialized areas. And so for the clinical development stage, we do have those different therapeutic areas. That's one of the therapeutic areas that I head up, the Inflammation and AutoImmunity Group. But all the other groups really are broken up by function chemistry. We don't have a separate inflammation autoimmunity chemistry group. The chemistry team works on different projects. Mm-hmm. And if it happens to be an inflammation autoimmunity group, that's great, but they don't belong into that sort of separate, distinct function. It's really only the clinical group that is broken up by therapeutic area.
Does that create a very specific, I guess, sort of persona? Like, let's say that you're looking at adding some research scientists. Does that approach dictate sort of the approach that the company takes in terms of the specific research scientists that it pursues? I guess, does that have an impact on the type of talent that you're looking for to join the R&D departments?
Absolutely. And so, when you're in a therapeutic area, get experience, that's the type of person that we want to bring on board from the outside to join our team. We do bring in people who are less experienced, and obviously they get training, they get exposure to the therapeutic area. But when we look outside for external candidates, we definitely want experience in the therapeutic area of interest. And in my case, when I hire, I look for people with experience in the dermatology space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which you have plenty of. I'm sure you can recognize that experience in a hurry, given your. We'll get into that in a little bit. Some of your experience in that dermatology space, but I'm curious also about the research strategy there. I guess the molecular discovery / acquisition / partnership strategy. There are a million ways to build a pipeline. You can turn to academia and acquire novel molecules that are newly discovered. You can buy novel molecules that are at any point in their design development, or even clinical stages. You can rely solely on internal discovery and kind of come to market with your own thing. What's the modus operandi at Incyte?
Well, as you mentioned, there are many different approaches to build out your pipeline and then to continue to grow your pipeline. And our main focus is we have such good scientists, biologists, chemists that the core, most of our projects, most of our molecules are developed internally. They're identified internally, and then we work on them, and many of those projects get into the clinic, into human studies. But we also recognize that not everything you work on is going to be successful. We are doing research, and so we're doing experiments, and we don't know what the results of those experiments are going to look like. So we understand there's always going to be an attrition rate internally for our projects, and so we have to also supplement our internal research with potential business development, licensing or acquisitions, collaborations, as you say, with academic sites to look for and understand potentially new targets for the diseases of interest. So we pretty much take all of the things that you just said. We do consider that, but the core of what we do is really internal, developing molecules, getting them to the clinic and developing them ourselves. But we also recognize that you would be foolish not to look at the external environment for potential partnerships.
Yeah. You mentioned, you briefly mentioned failure, and I'm curious about this. Failure being the sort of I don't want to say the norm, but the common common denominator, right, in early drug research and discovery. Failure is an interesting thing in this space because it's not always black and white, right? There are varying degrees of potential for therapeutics at the discovery stage, and decisions have to be made from a business perspective about, is this close enough to failure to shelve it, to can it, or is this maybe close enough to showing signs of potential success to maybe put it on a back burner and revisit it, or maybe put some secondary resources on it while we pursue more promising options. It's a very broad kind of gray area, and when you have that. And when you have individuals, human beings who are invested in their daily lives in a specific project, you have inevitably, emotional and professional connections to those projects that sometimes get shuffled, sometimes get canned, sometimes get shelved. So it makes me curious in an environment like the one at Incyte, where there's a lot of activity going on and a lot of different modalities and a lot of different indications. What sort of competition, internal and healthy? I don't mean this in a negative way, but what sort of healthy competition may or may not exist at Incyte for the resources to move a project forward?
And I think you mentioned it, that we are very emotionally vested into the projects that we're working on. And the reason for that is we learn about the disease state, about the patients and the suffering, the unmet needs. And as we progress a project, it's natural to invest some emotion into that. And so that does complicate decision making, and it's a good thing that it complicates decision making, right? Because we always want to keep the patient front and center. And but when, as you say, when there's some data, we run a study, and perhaps the study is not what we expected, what we had hoped for. That leads to decision making in terms of prioritization. Do you continue? Do you invest more resources, or do you then terminate or hold the project and deploy those resources into another important area? And those are questions that we all struggle with. Throughout my 25-year career at various companies, it's an ongoing challenge to make that decision. But ultimately, you go back to data and you really try to make a data-driven decision, looking at the data objectively and really setting aside the emotion, the biases, even though it can be very painful for many individuals knowing that you're walking away from a disease. So, but if you take the data and look at it objectively, if it's not going to really help the patients, I think that has to be part of decision making. If the data isn't good enough where it's going to help the patients, then you have to make the decision that obviously you should stop that program and deploy and focus on another disease, another program that can help either the same set of patients or perhaps a different disease condition. So that's how we think about it. In terms of that creating any internal competition, it really doesn't, because as long as the organization is really focused on patients, I think everyone can agree and does agree that we made the right decision. And then any potential competition among resources or for resources within the organization, they really never materialize. And so that, I think that's one of the things that Incyte does so well is we're on it together, we're one team, and when we do make a decision, yes, certain individuals, certain project team members will be disappointed, but we get over that, we move on, and then we focus on trying to help other patients.
Yeah. Sort of the old saying, in God we trust, all others bring all others must bring data, right? I want to try to get a sense for, obviously without physically being there and seeing the quote unquote operation, I want to ask you to try to help give us an illustration of what the R&D function at Incyte looks like. So maybe share some stats if you can around like people and facilities and you just what it looks like there, like what it takes to keep this big multimodal multi-indication engine on its toes.
So we have approximately 2,400 employees spread across three continents, countries, so Europe, North America, and Japan. A little over 1,000 of those 2,400 patients are scientists and work in the R&D space. Our main R&D hub is here in Wilmington, Delaware, where we have 2 laboratory buildings. And many of us, even though we're in the research space, many of us don't work in the laboratory buildings. And so it's very resource heavy and intensive company. And we spend probably 47% of our revenue, we actually reinvest that into R&D. So we're one of those companies that, we put a lot of resources into developing these drugs. And so it's a very large part of the Incyte culture. It's a large part of the organization. And so it's if you work in the R&D space like I do, it's a great place to be.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I'm curious, you can to the extent that you're able or willing to share. When you came on in 2018, as I said, you came on as the head of inflammation and autoimmunity at the company. Your appearance on the scene kind of coincided with an added focus on dermatology. When a new program comes into view at Incyte, is it immediately given the same access to those, that 47+% of resource to execute its job?
It's eventually it does get there. It's like any research project. Earlier on, there's healthy skepticism, as there should be, in terms of the potential for that project. And as you generate data and the data looks very promising, then obviously the company has invested a lot more resources into the dermatology space as well as other immunology projects. And so just to give you an example, when I joined the company 5 years ago, I think in my group there were 5 of us, and within the larger inflammation autoimmunity space within the various functions, I think there were a total of 50 people working on these projects. And right now, I think we have over 300 people on projects. And so it's been a steady growth, and at various milestones, when we've looked at the data and the data was very good, Incyte has obviously invested a lot more resources into this space because of the opportunity to help patients.
Yeah. Just to wrap up sort of this section on sort of the I guess illustration or description of the R&D function at Incyte. If you were looking at, I guess if you could go back in time and give Jim Lee, Dr. Jim Lee in his more formative early years of R&D management, specific to management, like managing the departments, managing the people. If you could give yourself some advice going into this endeavor, what would it be? And I'm sure we could probably go very long on this, but maybe give us some of your best nuggets.
Yeah, I think knowing what I know now, what would I tell my earlier self?
Yeah.
I think it just can always stay on top of the science, stay on top of the research, not only in what you're working on, but others are working on, because you just don't know when that next opportunity will come up or present itself. And whether it's an internal discovery or another company approaching you, having the broad breadth as well as expertise in a space, in our space, it's immunology, that's going to serve you well. And it's really about following the science, understanding all of the scientific pathways, the pathogenesis of the various diseases, because science is a slow process. I mean, if you think about it, JAK inhibitors were discovered probably 30 some years ago. And only about 5 or 6 years ago was it really observed that it could help a disease called vitiligo. And so it took a long time, 25 years, before someone connected the JAK-STAT pathway to actually working in a disease, a condition like vitiligo. So that's the advice I would give my younger self, is always stay on top of the science, always continue to read and look both internally and externally at new pathways that can help patients.
Yeah, very good. Like I said, I want to get into a bit of the story about how you came on the scene at Incyte. And in order to do that, we need to sort of take a retrospective of Dr. Jim Lee's career. So your previous 3 posts were all in the derm space. As we mentioned, you were CMO at Graceway Pharmaceuticals, VP and head of clinical medical dermatology at Stiefel. You need to brush up on my German. I think that's German.
That's correct.
And you were chief medical officer at Dermavant Sciences. So as I said, it's really no coincidence that you would join Incyte at this juncture, just prior to its establishment of Incyte Dermatology. So tell us the story, I guess, of that move to Incyte, the company's subsequent focus on dermatology, and where this head of inflammation and autoimmunity role at the company kind of intersects with the dermatology effort.
No, I always say it's better to be lucky than good, and opportunities arise, and if it's a good time for you to consider these new opportunities, then you really should consider yourself very lucky. And then that was the case when Incyte approached me 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, actually. They had an opening, for the head of the Inflammation and AutoImmunity Group. And so when I looked into the opportunity and learned more about Incyte, I saw that it really matched up with what I was looking for. And that is a company that's patient focused, that has excellent science, and have good molecules to work on. And so those are the main reasons why I joined Incyte, and it's been a great 5 years. I feel very fortunate to have this opportunity to develop drugs. We've gotten 2 approvals with ruxolitinib cream. We're advancing other drugs. Hopefully, we can get approved in the next few years. And so, it's actually for me, it matched up perfectly with what I was looking for. And to your earlier question, how did that sort of line up, or what did my previous experience do? Well, when you work in the field, I'm not a dermatologist. I actually was going to be an academic ophthalmologist. That's how I started my training after my MD Ph.D. And realized that I probably to focus in on research, I probably should get out of a surgical subspecialty. And so I finished up in internal medicine and happened to start working at 3M on asthma studies, of all things. Worked on asthma studies for a couple years, and then was able to start working on a topical product called Aldera, which got 3 approvals: basal cell carcinoma, actinic keratosis, and genital warts. And that was my foray over 22, 23 years ago into the dermatology space. And as I've just been very fortunate to have been able to work on at companies that focus in dermatology, but also on some great products as well. And all of that sort of helped me really look at this Incyte opportunity and say, wow, this is a great opportunity. It's a great company with great molecules. And so again, it was just my good fortune to have this opportunity come up when it did.
Yeah. It makes me curious. You mentioned a couple of times there in your response the great molecules, right? And when you're a scientist and you have the opportunity to work on great molecules, it's obviously intriguing. But it makes me curious about like when you were in that sort of recruiting stage and getting a look at the company and rationalizing the move in your own head. How deep behind the curtain does a company like Incyte allow a recruit in a role like yours to analyze what it's working on, right? Like, I mean, obviously you're going to be very, very deeply ingrained from day one, but at the same time, they're not going to have a parade of potential people walking through their labs analyzing the R&D function, right? I mean, there's some secret sauce there. It just makes me curious, like how far do you press that when you're looking at a new opportunity, and how much do they let you in?
Yeah. So they didn't let me do a deep dive, obviously, and they didn't need to because they had presented enough data externally out in the public domain. I could do my own diligence, reading up on the data that they had generated, that they had presented, as well as in the space they were competing in, and so that's what I did. So anyone who is considering a move should really do a deep diligence about the company that they're considering. And when I did that, when I learned more about Incyte, it was clear that they had some very good molecules and good products that had a lot of potential. And that's what excited me about the opportunity and really swayed me to come over and join the team.
Yeah. Previous to the three roles that I just mentioned in the derm space, you were director of immunology at Centocor, which is obviously focused on antibodies. I think the biggest claim to fame to date is infliximab. That makes me curious how your sort of straddle of the large and small molecule research worlds influences your personal drug discovery approach or your philosophy.
Yeah, it had a significant impact on how I think about treatment paradigms, treatment options for patients. It was my first exposure to the biologic space, and I was able to work on ustekinumab, which eventually became Stelara. And ironically, we had a molecule in the freezer that eventually has become Tremfya, that was approved many, many years later. And so it was a great experience, a great company. Obviously, they were part of Janssen and J&J at the time. And so getting that exposure to the biologics was very helpful in terms of how I look at things because since I left and in my subsequent jobs and positions, I've always looked at biologics, and clearly since then the use of biologics has grown dramatically. They've really helped a ton of patients, and so you really do have to look at biologics and small molecules as potential treatment options of solutions for patients. And so yes, it had a major impact on how I look at things. It also helped me in terms of the differences in regulatory approach for submissions and the data, and the differences in the presentation and the testing, et cetera, and things like that. So it was a great experience that I'm very grateful for, and it definitely impacted how I look at things and my approach subsequently.
Yeah. So given this, patient-centric worldview, modality agnostic, I guess, perspective, when you survey the biotech landscape, and when I say biotech, I'm talking about like new and emerging biopharma companies, preclinical companies, early stage clinical companies. We're seeing it's a trend. We're seeing a lot of companies that are decidedly specific. We're seeing a lot of platform companies coming about where, perhaps it's a platform that's purpose built and dedicated to a single modality. A lot of companies that are focused on very specific indications. Does that, what do you make of that? Like, does that bode well? Does it, do you feel like perhaps that platform spinning off products in a specific place approach is maybe a little bit myopic? I mean, what's your general take on it?
I think it's very useful to have platforms and technologies that scientists are able to test, and clinicians are able to develop. And I think if it ultimately leads to better drugs, safer drugs, I think it's a great thing. But I think as I think your last point alluded to, sometimes people can just latch onto the platform itself, and forgetting about the science, forgetting about the pathway and the disease, and that I don't think is a very useful or helpful approach. And the reason for that is you're not developing a platform, you're really developing a treatment. And so the platform, if it can lead to a better treatment, that is a great thing. But it's not a one size fits all, or never should be looked at as a one size fits all, a solution or approach. You really do. I mean, this is science we're doing, right? Human body is very complex. And so to think that one thing is going to sort of be the cure-all for everything is probably not likely going to happen. And so it's a great tool. It's a great addition to the armamentarium in terms of, addressing and trying to solve solutions or sort of solve problems. But I think if you're presenting it as sort of the next best thing since sliced bread, it's probably an overreach. But I think it's an important advancement and an additional tool that we have access to get patients better drugs.
Yeah. I want to jump back real quick to some of the commentary you were making about your academic years, right? And your your moves, right? Like lateral moves, like ophthalmology, dermatology, right? You kind of covered a lot of ground there. But when you were back when you were considering practicing, when you were considering, you were just perhaps staying in academia and ophthalmological research, when you decided to make the move to industry, obviously you did that for some specific reasons. There's opportunity to reach more patients, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, it's a considerable move. I mean, it's a different world. There are different expectations. I guess the question I'm getting at is like, what were the primary motivations and what were the primary anxieties, perhaps that you pondered before you made that move?
No, it's a fair question. And, I really hadn't thought about a career in the pharmaceutical industry or clinical research space. When you train in medicine and when you're doing research, you don't get exposed to that side, or at least I didn't back in the 90s. And so during my training, this is the first time I get exposed to clinical research, and it intrigued me because basically you're asking a scientific question, but you're testing it in human subjects, which is a very complex and challenging environment to run experiments. And as I learned more, I became very intrigued. And then I learned more and realized that area was a great space to apply sort of the scientific knowledge, the information into human diseases. And that's when I really became interested in a career. And so once I learned more, once I learned about what you get to do and ultimately developing drugs and taking care of, it's great clinicians, you can take care of lots of patients, but in a way, when you develop a new drug, you can take care of thousands of patients, right? You can help thousands of individuals. So all of those things sort of led me to make the jump into pharmaceutical research. And in terms of apprehension, I didn't really have any apprehension because it was a research-oriented job, which is what I wanted, but it still had that connection to the patients, which I also wanted to maintain. And so I look back at it, I really didn't know what was involved But to your previous question, what would I tell myself? I say, this is a great field. Knowing what I wanted to do, what I was interested in doing back then, I would tell myself, this is the perfect role, this perfect opportunity to based on what my interests were at the time. And so, I look back on it, I just feel very fortunate to have had this opportunity to work in this space, and also very fortunate to have different, exposures, different companies to work at, because that in itself also, I think we haven't touched upon that, but every company is different, and I've had many different experiences, and so I've been able to see how different companies approach things, how they do things, and that also has helped me in my current role in terms of managing processes, managing people, and so all of the above. It's been a great experience, great learning, and I continue to learn. I learn from everyone around here, and that's what I love to do. I love to continue to learn. I love asking questions. I'm still very curious about pathways and about why things happen, and so this has been a great career move for me, and I'm very happy that I did it.
Yeah, very good. You mentioned the desire to impact patients and the fact that you can still do that when you're working in pharmaceutical research, and perhaps on a broader scale, right? If things are going right. At the same time, when you enter an R&D lab at a mid cap or larger pharmaceutical company, as a research scientist, perhaps, or even as someone who's leading those research scientists, it can be difficult to maintain that connection to the patient-centric kind of mission-driven mentality. So how do you maintain that, and how do you maintain that for your troops, right? Like, how do you, I guess it's one thing if you're in the working in the clinical department and you're making direct connections with physicians and practitioners who are participating in your trial, and patients even that are participating in your trials. But when you're in an R&D lab, is it challenging to kind of like go in every day and maintain that, like, hey, what we're doing is drawing connecting a direct line between this important work and the patient community?
That's a great point, and it is a lot more challenging. So if you're working in a basic research lab, and it is because you don't have the sort of the frequent exposure. You don't have the frequent interactions with people who take care of patients. And so what we try to do internally is to always remind people why we're doing this, right? And that's the patients. And so just that reminder in itself can have a good impact and remind folks who are in the trenches, so to speak, in terms of the research, why we're doing this and why we continue to work hard and dedicate ourselves to our work. And then we also, try to get people to scientific meetings. Sometimes those meetings will include presentations on clinical topics. And so, we can try to connect our employees in that way closer to the patient that way. And then Incyte also, for our approved indications, we do bring in patients who actually have asked to speak to the scientists who worked on the product, so they can thank all of the scientists for their past work and continued work on behalf of patients. And so we take a multi-pronged approach to try to help connect everyone within the company to that patient.
Yeah. I want to get back to the sort of the strategy at Incyte a little bit and get some understanding around here. I mean, I feel like inflammation is a good place to be because it's got so much, and it's inherently connected with so many disease states, so many that, frankly, Incyte has a legacy in. I mean, on oncology, for instance, and the understanding of inflammation's role as, a product of or causal of so many different disease states. It's a great place to be. I mean, I think generally speaking, but I'm curious about how, the strategy at Incyte dovetails or intertwines, or recognizes common threads of connection between inflammation and oncology and dermatology, and even perhaps some of the other indications that the company has found success in.
You absolutely nailed it. There are common threads between cancer and inflammation. And so we've known that for a while. We actually have leveraged our expertise in both of those areas. And so just give you an example, chronic inflammation contributes to many of the myeloproliferative neoplasms, the disorders that ruxolitinib is approved for, the oral version of ruxolitinib approved for. But it also it contributes to many of the symptoms, the skin inflammation, the topical ruxolitinib is improved for. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of the basic mechanisms that drive or contribute to many diseases that happen to be both inflammatory disorders as well as cancers. And so we the field has known that. I think we've become leaders in that space and been able to leverage expertise in those pathways, those basic science pathways, in the therapeutic areas of both oncology and inflammation, autoimmunity. So yeah, absolutely. There's lots of connections there. And so we have experts who can tell us and work in different projects that encompass both the autoimmunity space, but also the cancer space.
Yeah, so they're not working in silos or vacuums, so to speak. There's a lot of interplay there. Yeah. So you mentioned the first U.S. approval in the Incyte dermatology lineup was a topical JAK inhibitor approved for the treatment of eczema and vitiligo. What's next in the dermatology lineup? What do you guys, to the extent that you can share, right? Like what are you guys working on now?
Yeah, and we continue to work on ruxolitinib cream or Opzelura. There are additional indications that we're evaluating. We've just shared with the external community our results in atopic dermatitis in patients 2 to 11. So we're approved for 12 and above in atopic dermatitis, and we've just completed or are in the process of completing a study in the younger kids. And so we continue to work broadening the age range as well as looking at other inflammatory skin disorders for ruxolitinib cream. We have an oral JAK1 specific molecule that we have 2 ongoing phase 3 programs. We've just shared the top line results of a phase 2 program in prurigo nodularis, a different inflammatory disorder of the skin. And so we continue to invest in dermatology as well as looking at other inflammatory disorders. So those are the main things that we're doing that are going to come up in the next few years for our therapeutic area. And obviously, we're continuing to look at other targets, other diseases that we can evaluate so that we can bring better medicines to patients that need them.
Yeah. Do you have a forecast or any forward-looking statements on the role of biologics in dermatology, perhaps? And I ask that question sort of selfishly because the show is primarily focused on biopharma, right? Like we cover large molecule therapies. We have a lot of vaccine and antibody manufacturers on the show. I'm just curious what role biologics might play, again, to the extent that you can share. I don't expect you to go too deep into the R&D lab, but is there a place?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're very excited that we're able to acquire a monoclonal antibody directed against the IL-15 receptor beta. So it's an anti-CD122 monoclonal antibody. We just got it into the clinic this year and hope to continue to progress it. And we believe by targeting IL-15 at the receptor, it can knock down tissue-resident memory cells. So CD8 positive tissue-resident memory cells. And so that's an exciting target for us. And our, at least from a therapeutic area perspective, our first foray into biologics. Obviously, Incyte has been working on a number of different biologics. We have a couple, one approved. And so it's nothing new to Incyte, but for our therapeutic area, it's our first biologic, and we're hoping obviously to bring additional biologics forward, and obviously that depends on the disease and the targets, but because we want to make sure that we get the targets right for the specific disease, but it's an area of opportunity, an area of growth for us, and so we're excited to have that and excited to continue to work in that space.
Yeah, very good. I warned you that I was going to ask you a question that's decidedly out of your realm. If I had the chief commercial officer of Incyte on the show, I'm sure that we could have a lengthy discussion about the value of the celebrity of Mandy Moore as a spokesperson for Incyte. And I had to ask the question because I'm just going to go ahead and say it at the risk of, my wife already knows. I mean, Mandy Moore is my celebrity crush. But she not too long ago, Incyte landed Mandy Moore as a spokesperson for some of its eczema therapeutics. Does that impact even does the momentum behind a sort of a celebrity? I don't want to call it an endorsement. Maybe it's an endorsement. It's a partnership. Does that trickle down into the R&D department at all? Does it create any momentum for you guys?
I think we're excited to see Incyte, the ability of Incyte to partner with someone as famous as Mandy Moore. Obviously, it's the primary goal is to increase awareness to patients who have eczema. Let them know that they're not alone. And to obviously get them thinking about seeing a dermatologist if their disease is not adequately treated. And so I think it's great for patients. From that perspective, it obviously trickles down to R&D because, even though we're in R&D, we really do care about the patient. So to see that brings us happiness, right?
Yeah.
But from a direct effect on R&D, no, it doesn't have a direct effect.
Sure.
But ultimately, if I think we have 45, I think I mentioned earlier, 45% of our revenue we reinvest in R&D. So indirectly, it potentially could. But I think it ultimately goes back to the patients and just the increasing awareness to patients that there are more than just the old topical corticosteroids and calcineurin inhibitors, other topicals available to them. And it's amazing. There's 20 to 25 million Americans who have AD, only about 5 or 5.5 that actually go seek treatment. So there's just a lack of awareness out there. And even among patients who seek treatment, many of them are really not satisfied with their treatment, right? And so it's really important. We assume that everyone's seeing their doctor, that everyone's seeing their dermatologist, and that's just not the case. And I think having someone, as you say, of Mandy Moore's stature to help educate and bring that awareness is a great thing. And just from an R&D perspective, I think it helps us because we know that hopefully the drug that we got to work on is helping as many patients as possible.
Yeah, that was a very good answer to a question I wasn't even sure I should ask because it was just sort of an shiny thing that I thought, I got to ask him about Mandy Moore. But you gave a very good response to my left field question, Dr. Lee. What milestones are next for you? Like if you look at your immediate horizon in the R&D department there and the work that you're doing, what's next on your plate?
Yeah, so it's continuing to develop the drugs that we're working on. I think I mentioned earlier, we're not done with ruxolitinib cream. We're working on the oral JAK1. We have this new monoclonal antibody. We continue to look for additional assets that could help patients, right? And so that's really the next step is just continuing to do what we've been doing, always focusing on developing drugs for patients. And it's sometimes it sounds hackneyed, it's overused a lot, but it is really what drives us. What drives me is we want to help as many patients as possible, knowing that we're not going to be able to help everyone, but if we can help as many people as possible, then that would gives us the people in R&D. That's what gives us job satisfaction because as you said, a lot of us we're sort of working in the lab, not really well connected. But when we find out and we get to work on a drug that ultimately helps somebody, it's very rewarding. It's just makes you feel like you've really helped society and helped people out, and that's for many of us, that's a very important part of our lives.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah. Well, I appreciate it, Dr. Lee. I know we're short on time here, so I'm going to let you get on with your day. But I do really appreciate the opportunity to get to know you a little bit, and for the peek behind the curtain of the R&D ops there at Incyte. Very very insightful, for lack of a better word, and very much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed our conversation.
So did I.
All right.
So that was Incyte's Dr. Jim Lee. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Life Science Connects Bioprocess Online, which offers a trove of peer-generated content for biotech leaders at bioprocessonline.com. If you like listening in on conversations with biotech leaders like Dr. Lee, subscribe to the Business of Biotech podcast and sign up for our newsletter at bioprocessonline.com/BOB. Also, be sure to leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing. And as always, thanks for listening.